Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second in our Inspiring Student Research webinar series. I can talk tonight. We're so excited to have you back here with us. I'm joined here by Dr. Chris Capozzola, who's going to be kicking things off with the topic of Stop Staring and Why Historians Are the Rudest People, Part 2. And then I'm also joined this evening by Elena McNaughton. Elena is NHD's National Contest Manager. She joined our team in December last year, and then, her first contest kind of went a little differently, but she's been listening in on a lot of these, and she's been kind enough to join to help with the question box. So let's just kind of go over a couple quick housekeeping details. You know this from the first one. Q&A box, use it. Drop questions in. We'll have a good Q&A session. We'll stay on and answer as many as we possibly can at the end. That survey at the end is required, so make sure you fill that out and give us your feedback. That's really helpful. We take that feedback, we read it, we summarize it, and we use it to make adjustments moving forward for each of the webinars. Because if we're not responsive to you, why are we doing this? Obviously, the slides are actually already up on Schoology. We'll get that video posted tomorrow morning. And Module 3 will launch on Friday. So, okay, I've said enough here. Let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Capozzola, it's over to you this evening.
All right, so thank you, Lynn, and thank you all for coming tonight. I know that, after being, for a lot of people, have been on Zoom or some other platform all day, and you're back tonight, so I appreciate the time and the effort, and we're gonna sort of dive in to thinking about visual images. And last time we met, about a month ago, I told you that historians are the rudest people because we do incredibly impolite things like open other people's mail. And we spent last month thinking about letters, why people write them, how they communicate with letters, and how that's changed over time. But it turns out that there's a lot of reasons why historians are rude people, and the other is that we can't stop staring, right? That we like to look at people and images from the past. We sort of get nosy about people's business and sort of look at both their public images and often their private images, their photo collections, scrapbooks, and so forth. Those are, sort of invaluable things for historians as we try to figure out how people lived in the past and also how they made sense of the world around them as they were living through it, right? We are living obviously in 2020 through very unique historical times. And when people look back at us and try to figure out how did they make sense of the world that they lived through, one thing they'll want to do is sort of look at our visual images. How did we represent our society in America, our politics? How did we represent the pandemic around the world? Both in public images and private ones, right? And so recording images is crucial. Studying them is crucial. If you want your students to work with primary sources, to work with the original things created by people in the past, then you're going to want them to not just read texts, but also look at images. And I think a lot of us as teachers, at whatever level we're teaching, educators, we like to make sure that our students are looking critically, that we're training them with visual literacy skills that help them consume visual images in critical ways, right? And one really good way of doing that is to get them to look at images that they didn't make, images from a very long time ago, and try to make sense of them, right? Sort of understanding the strangeness of the past in order to maybe make our own time a little more strange too, right? A little more different. That we can think critically about the images around us if we look at some ones from far away. But like I said, it's not always easy, right? And there are a couple of, I would say, 3 things that are challenges for working with images in the classroom, whatever level you're teaching at, right? One is the challenge of figuring out from an image that might just be clipped out of nowhere, what's the context? Who made this image? Why did they make it? What was the intended audience, right? And so that's all about context, all about teaching the skills that our students might need so that their first impression is a beginning place for research rather than an endpoint for knowing, right? That it's supposed to generate questions, not answers. And we'll look at that in a couple of situations tonight. Second, sometimes images are very far away from our present, right? We're used to certain kinds of depictions, and other ones might seem strange or far away. And if you don't believe me, try showing your students a silent movie from like the 1920s. And the visual conventions are so different that it's very hard to wrap your mind around the way people did things in different time periods. And different cultures, of course, also have different ways of representing themselves, representing other cultures. Even just general visual vocabulary can be very different in different cultures. That's not a bad thing, right? That's a good thing. That's something that it's our task to teach students to inquire about, to do research about, and to learn. Right, and then third, of course, and this came up a little bit in the Q&A before we started at 7 o'clock with people who came on early, is that some images are difficult. They're difficult for us to teach with, either because they depict violence of war or other things, or because they depict some ethnic or other groups in ways that those groups might find negative or disparaging. Right, and I think this came up already in our discussion that we all, as educators, are already thinking about this, and we're sort of thinking about our students, where they are, equipping them to see those images, but also making sure that they're ready to sort of to see them, and that not everyone's going to be in the same place, right? So we can talk about that more in the Q&A. In the images tonight, I've generally tried to pick images that would work in most classrooms, most grade levels, and avoided some of the others that are online that are more, include sometimes offensive images. Of course, you're going to make the best choices for your students about what to use. So what I'm going to do is tonight we're going to look at two specific examples, two case studies. And you did a little bit of reading and a little bit of looking ahead of time to think about those. The first comes from the American women's suffrage movement, particularly in the period between 1910 and 1920, when you see the push to the 19th Amendment and its ratification. A kind of crucial moment that we all just saw a bunch of centennial celebrations about in the last few months, and worth sort of thinking about again today. And then the second is from an earlier time period, from 1853, 1854, and some of the very first times that Americans and Japanese interacted with each other following the visit of Commodore Matthew Perry and the US Navy to Japan on Perry's expedition. And again, this is a topic that is good to teach with, both for US history and also may be valuable for world history, depending on what subjects you're teaching. The other reason I picked these two case studies is that they are very well represented at the Library of Congress. That there are, if you follow the trail of the links in the document packet, you'll see that where I put in one or two suffrage cartoons on the LC website, there are dozens and hundreds. And similarly, the images from Perry's expedition, there are tons of them on the Library of Congress website. And you'll also see that both of these topics have online teaching material and related resources that the Library of Congress has also assembled in the past. So there's all kinds of ways that you can kind of just keep digging and digging, or let your students do some exploring in the Library of Congress online materials. So as we do this, as we think about why historians are the rudest people, because we keep staring at people in the past, I want to keep in mind 4 guiding questions. And if you were at last month's webinar, you'll recognize these questions. They're just slightly tinkered for our topic tonight. Right? First, how have people used images to inform or persuade? How can the same visual techniques mean different things? This is a visual literacy question that we'll get to in the middle. Third, how have images shaped communication across cultures, for better or for worse? Right, and we'll look at this in the Matthew Perry example. And then fourth, for discussion at the end, how can we inspire students to find and use resources like this, right? So let's start with this first one. How have people used images to inform or to persuade? And I want to start with the power of images, right? The power of images to communicate a political goal and to communicate, sort of a message, right? And to do that visually in a way that touches people in ways that words alone might not. And with that, I want to turn to the women's suffrage movement of the turn of the century. What you see here is a roadside billboard that is put up by the National Woman's Party, one of the two main political organizations pushing for women's suffrage in the 1910s. And this is from Colorado. And just to back up and give a kind of mini background, that although many of you may know this history already, there is a push for women's suffrage already long underway following the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. In most of the 19th century, that focus was on winning state-by-state battles, right? And particularly in the Western states, there were victories for women voters, including in Colorado, one of the first states that gave women the right to vote. But by the 1910s, those state-by-state efforts had kind of stalled out, and there was an increasing push to achieve the ballot for women through a constitutional amendment, what would eventually be the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920. But in 1910, that was not really a sure thing, right? And so this billboard is advocating that women of Colorado should use their ballot to go out and influence the election in order to get the ballot for the women of other states who did not yet have the right to vote, right? In this case, arguing for voting against Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic candidate for Congress because the Democratic Party opposes national women's suffrage. Right, at least, or it did in the 1916 election. By 1918, Woodrow Wilson has changed his mind on that issue, which we'll talk about at the end. But for now, this is a movement that is trying to persuade both women who have the vote to use it to advance suffrage, and also trying to persuade men to convince them that they should support women's suffrage, right? To sort of inform and persuade men. There are divisions within the women's suffrage movement. There are sort of moderates and radicals. Very soon after this image is taken, the National Women's Party will take to picketing, protesting in front of the White House, really pushing Woodrow Wilson on his policies. It's also a diverse movement. It includes younger women, older women, and many women of color as well. Right? And if you did the background reading chapter, it gives you a brief sense for how sort of women of all different backgrounds are using images to advance their political goals. Now, what it does is that wherever people are, they turn to some of the leading cutting edge media strategies of the day. And visual images are that. Right? So it's also worth thinking, what's the background in the history of media and representation, right? We have to remind students when you teach this that there wasn't television, right? In fact, there wasn't in the 1910s, there wasn't radio, right? There were movies, right? They were incredibly popular. They didn't look like the movies that we go to today. There were also posters, there were advertisements, there were sort of inserts into newspapers, which increasingly had photographs in them, right? So people at the time certainly thought that they were drenched in visual images, kind of the way we do now. We think, oh, people are surrounded by visual images and screens, right? 100 years ago, that people also felt the same way, right? That they felt they had never been in a world with so many images, and images that could be very powerful and persuasive, right? And of course, along with this are also political cartoons, right? So the images that are in the packet run the gamut from posters to cartoons, to sort of advertisements, to illustrations. And we'll look at a couple of these along the way. Now, one of the first things that we have to ask is about audience, or sort of about authorship, and then audience. Who drew it and who did they draw it for, right? Just as we would with a document, who wrote it and who did they write it to, right? And so this is an image that's in the packet. Right, and we don't know very much about it, right? Except that it's from, it's from about 1909. It has this header, Election Day, and we know that the illustrator was E.W. Guston. So I've designed a couple of polls for us to take along the way. These are really easy, and so I'm not grading them. They don't count for anybody's rubrics. But hopefully even, whatever grade level you're teaching, they'd be able to answer this question. So Elena, maybe I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you want to introduce poll number 1.
All right. The first poll is asking, who do you think drew this image? A supporter of women's suffrage or an opponent? So let's see, these are going to be real quick ones tonight. So be ready, have your mouse ready. All right, we got 70% voting, 80. Oh, we're going quickly tonight. All right, our results are 20% of you said a supporter and 80% said an opponent.
All right, excellent, thank you. And so that gives us a sense that at first glance, right, that we may not entirely know, but most people got the right answer, right, that this is by an opponent of women's suffrage. And if you read in the postings that a lot of you did over the last week or two, many of you sort of wrote about this image and pointed out the ways in which the illustrator suggests that if women could vote, it would cause them to abandon their responsibilities in the home, right? Leaving, presumably this is a married couple, the woman is leaving the house and the husband is left behind to care for the children, clean the dishes, etc. Do the laundry. God forbid, any husbands have to do any of these things, right? So apparently terrible, terrible things like dishes and laundry would be imposed upon men if they voted to give women the right to vote, right? So in that sense, it would have been seen as humorous by some men, dismissive or belittling, right, to the women's suffrage movement in a lot of ways. So let's take a look at the next one, which was also here in the packet, right? Number 2. And if you look closely, right, this is actually the first page of a song sheet, right, of sheet music. At a time when middle-class Americans were buying pianos or singing or sort of learning music, that sheet music was acquired as rapidly as people download songs today, right? And so whenever there was a public issue in the day, there was very quickly going to be a sort of pop song about it. And this song, She's Good Enough to Be Your Baby's Mother, and She's Good Enough to Vote With You, from 1916. And we have another quick poll to see what people think about this one.
All right, new image, same question. Is this drawn by a supporter of women's suffrage or an opponent? Oh, we're going quickly here. We've already gotten 75% to vote. Oh, this one is pretty clear cut in our audience. 100% of our respondents said it was a supporter.
All right. So, like I said, these were not hard questions, but feel free to kind of snag these polls and use them with some of your students who might take a little longer to get through this, particularly at the middle school grades, and really need some time to go through things. But yes, this is from a supporter of women's suffrage, and again, another task you might do in class is, well, okay, how do you know that? Right, so then you're using visual evidence to make an argument. What in this image made you so sure of that? Made 100% of us sure of that, right? But could you get middle school kids, for example, to be able to articulate why they're sure of that, and what part of it is visual, what's in the words, etc. All right, so one more quick poll, which is again, this is asking us who drew this image with the title "Hugging a Delusion." And we see a woman holding something marked "The Ballot," and this appeared in Life magazine in November 11th, 1915. So I didn't ask. It's not going to ask you was it by someone supporter or opponent of women's suffrage, because if you look at the bottom, you'll see that it's issued by the New York State Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. So we have a slightly different poll for you at this point.
All right, so this poll is going to ask, who do you think drew the image? A man, a woman, or don't know / not sure? And we want everybody to respond to this one. You might be right, you might be wrong, it's okay. All right, we've got 78. Come on, last couple people, drop your votes in. Take your guesses. Oh, this is an interesting one. 64% said a man, 21% said a woman, and another 15% said not sure.
All right. So there's very little evidence in this to go on, but we do know, if you look in the bottom right corner closely, that it's by an artist named Laura E. Foster, who was a woman and was a leading female anti-suffrage activist. And I always like to teach about this group when I teach about women's suffrage, because it's not intuitive to most of us. Most of us would think that women supported suffrage and men opposed suffrage, but it didn't break down quite neatly on those lines. Right? There were men who supported women's suffrage. Of course, it never would have passed without men's support for the ballot, and there were women who opposed it. Right? Particularly in this case, usually elite women who were opposed to the expansion of the franchise in general, or in Laura Foster's case, from what we know about her anyway, women who opposed the expansion of the ballot because they felt that women had carved out a very powerful political voice for themselves outside of politics, as nonpartisan, as non-political, and thought that would be sort of weakened if they had access to the ballot. And so there's some good resources on the Library of Congress website, and of course, many others produced this year during the centennial that look at this sort of curious case of female anti-suffragists. And so, it's a good way to kind of test students' assumptions about who takes a political position, as well as who makes a particular image, right? But again, you could ask them, is there any evidence in this picture that would help us know if this was by a man or a woman? And there really isn't, right? Unless we look very closely at the artist's signature in the bottom right corner. All right, so let me go on from here to give an example of the second guiding question, right? How can the same visual techniques mean different things? And this is one among many sort of visual literacy tools that can be useful for teaching with students. And if you look in the images of the women's suffrage campaign, and just look at them as images, right? What's happening in 2 dimensions as opposed to what's happening in 3 dimensions. Often you'll see the same visual devices. There will be, sort of a woman in thought sitting in a chair, like we saw in the previous image, right? But that could be used for suffrage or against suffrage, right? And here I chose 2, right? Here's our friend Laura Foster again. And this might be a little hard for you to see on the screen, but when you download the PowerPoint, you'll be able to read this very closely. That at the bottom of this staircase are all kinds of things that she should value: love, marriage, children, and home. And then along the way, things that she would regret: flattery, disappointment, suffrage, strife, anxiety, and loneliness, right? So Foster is suggesting that suffrage women are sort of moving away from what they truly want or what they truly owe to society, right? So this is an anti-suffrage image that's criticizing the suffrage movement for its disruption of gender roles. And then similarly, here's another image, right? By Elmer Bushnell, who supported women's suffrage. The sky is now her limit. This is drawn in August of 1920, right after the 19th Amendment is ratified by enough states to be ratified. And you won't be able to read this necessarily on the screen, but you can blow it up later and see that this is a ladder that shows a woman's ability to climb from, at the bottom, slavery, house drudgery, and shop work, through to equal suffrage and sort of full political participation and contribution to society. So some of that is about work, but some of that is also about women's sort of ability to use the ballot to be full citizens. Now, if you just looked at them, like I said, in 2 dimensions and not 3, they look pretty similar, right? There's the image of a ladder, right? But that could be used to do different things. And we could, ask our students, sort of, how does the image do its work, right? And sometimes you need to look at a lot of images to know, to see a pattern. And it's okay for students to kind of scroll through a bunch of images and let the pattern sort of emerge, right? And depending on how much time you have to devote to it. If you have less time, maybe you kind of give them a selection of images, where they can think, for example, what might a ladder mean in the early 20th century? What's our cultural assumptions about it now? How might some religious traditions that sort of imagine that there's some paradise up there, how might they interpret a ladder, right, or a staircase that goes up into the sky, right? And how might that be used to advance an argument, right? So these are things that even the artists themselves may not have thought consciously about, right? We don't know, what made Elmer Bushnell think about a ladder, or what made Laura Foster think about a staircase. But something in their own cultural experience led them to that. They had that sort of spark that made them draw it this way. And it sort of helps us see what this does in the visual culture of the time. And similarly, you could then ask them to look for something like this in the visual culture of today, right? What is a visual convention, right, or a technique that people use either in political cartoons today, in advertising images today, in social media, visual social media today, and get them to kind of think critically about this, right? So that's one other way of thinking about how visual images work, in addition to sort of how they have changed over time. And then I just wanted to end our section on visual culture and suffrage by asking what happens when this ongoing discussion about women's suffrage intersects with the US entry into the First World War. Right, so of course in 1914, war breaks out in Europe, and very quickly Americans go to Europe as volunteers, largely in humanitarian positions, in medical and nursing and other fields. You can see here an image of a Red Cross nurse serving a battlefield soldier who's been injured. And if you may not be able to read it, on the bottom left corner, it says, "The weaker sex, question mark." And underneath it, it says, "Woman's place is in the home," a quote attributed to the anti-suffragists. So clearly it's that question mark in the weaker sex is very important. And it's a challenge that many suffragists use between 1914 and particularly after 1917, when the United States enters the war, that women used their wartime service to argue that Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats and also the Republicans should sort of endorse women's suffrage as a constitutional amendment. Woodrow Wilson makes that sort of mental change in November of 1918, or September of 1918, right before the midterm elections. He endorses women's suffrage, and very soon thereafter, the amendment is introduced, and by 1920, it's ratified. Right? And so that is a political process, but it also turned out to be a visual one as well. And I'm not going to show you all these images, but of course, many of us teach World War I propaganda and its posters in both world history, European history, American history. And if you stop to think about the way in which women's suffrage imagery and wartime propaganda imagery are doing some of the same work. They're trying to use images to persuade, to inform, to provoke action and emotion. And I think we often teach them separately. But the Americans who walked down the streets in the 1910s would have seen some of these same images at the same time. And I think just seeing those two together can be really useful for thinking about how people used images to inform and persuade, and then also how those change over time. All right, so I'm going to switch gears here to part 2 to talk about how images have shaped communication across cultures, both for better or worse. Right? And so let me just take a brief detour here to talk about miscommunication. And I have a very good story about cultural miscommunication, which I will tell at the expense of 2 members of my family. So in high school, my sister was an exchange student in Mexico. And she was living with a host family and learning Spanish, but was pretty new to Spanish, and was living with a Mexican host family. And she dropped something or spilled something, and she said, and she was very embarrassed, and so she said, "Estoy embarazada." Now, if you speak Spanish, you will know that what she just told her host family is, I'm pregnant. There's a very real risk of miscommunication through language across culture. Now, here's the problem, is that a couple of years later, my other sister was also a foreign exchange student, and she went to France. They had a very nice dinner. She was living with a French host family. They had a very nice dinner. She ate first, she ate second, she ate dessert. They asked if she wanted more, and she said, no, je suis pleine, which, if you know French, means that she has just told her host family, I am pregnant. So there's clearly a running theme in this, which is that my sisters should not go out into the world without a dictionary. But in any case, cultural miscommunication can lead to moments of humor and misunderstanding. It can also lead to misunderstanding that can be problematic, right? That can lead to conflict or provoke conflict or misunderstanding of two different cultures. And we see both of these things at work in the second case study that I want to look at tonight. Right? First, it is this guiding question: how have images shaped communication across cultures for better and for worse? And I want to look in depth, and you read already some images, you saw some documents about the so-called black ships and samurai, the interaction of Americans and Japanese in the years around 1854, basically 1853, 4, 5, as Commodore Matthew Perry visits Japan as part of an official American expedition. Right? Now, Perry was sent by President, and you can see him here, by President Millard Fillmore to open trade relations with Japan, a country with which the United States had almost no trade, no exchange, no contact whatsoever, despite the fact that the United States was quite active in Asia by the 1850s. There was trade with China, there was Navy exploration, there was whaling, there was all kinds of sort of interaction, but not with Japan. And the United States wanted more of that. They wanted trade, they wanted sort of military connections, they wanted the opportunity for American missionaries to enter the country. Japan in general was less interested in having outsiders and felt that their independence would be better preserved without the Americans there. But in 1853, July of 1853, Perry makes a first visit to Tokyo Bay, Edo as the city was known at the time, and then returns a year later, 1854, with more ships and stays longer and eventually signs a treaty between the two countries that allows for greater trade and for the presence of American consular officials. So that much we know, right? There's a paragraph about that in most American history textbooks, even in most world or Asian history textbooks. But stop and do a little moment of imagination, right? What would that have been like, right? And so if I were doing this in class, I would leave a little time for explanation, for imagination, right? If I were with, college students, I would be asking them to jot down some thoughts in writing. If I were teaching little kids, I might ask them even to do some drawing, right? And sort of imaginative drawing, right? But think about this, and you might have one student, either you ask all the students to think about two things, or you divide them up into groups to sort of think, what would have been in your mind if you were an American sailor arriving in Japan in 1853, right? You're arriving in Edo Bay, what's now Tokyo, in a country that you know very little about, right? And so what kinds of questions would be in your mind? What kinds of images might be in your mind? What might you be curious about? What might you be excited, afraid of? All those kinds of things. Give students a little time to imagine, to put themselves in the mind of Matthew Perry or some ordinary sailor on the ship. And then second, what would have been in your mind if you were a Japanese fisher, right? If you're fishing in Edo Bay in 1853 and these American ships sort of arrive, and ships that you haven't really seen before, right? Because they're coal-fired steam ships, not just regular sailing ships like you have in Japan, right? What would you be curious about? What would you be excited about? What would you be afraid about? right? And sort of do that kind of imagination. And then we can dive into what the visual record shows us about how Americans and Japanese saw each other, right? And we have this image here of Matthew Perry, and this was taken by Matthew Brady, a very sort of famous Civil War photographer. In fact, he came up in the Q&A at the very beginning of before we even got started tonight, right? And Matthew Perry took portraits of almost every famous person in the 19th century. This very distinguished picture of Matthew Perry here by an American photographer. We also have, from the collections of the Library of Congress, this image of Matthew Perry from 1854 by a Japanese artist, right? You can see there's some similarities, some differences, right? You know, he looks, he has the same kind of, you know, facial structures in both places. And if you did the reading on especially on the online website that I shared with you, you'll see that historians have reconstructed, you know, what are the visual traditions that Japanese artists would have brought to this, right? We know that someone like Matthew Brady as a photographer, even though that's a new technology, Matthew Brady knows that what it means to take a portrait of a powerful person, right? You know, how the person stands, how to depict them, how to make them look sort of strong and powerful through visual images. And we also know that Japanese visual traditions are also being used here. How do they depict someone using the images of a warrior, right? What you see here, some of these colors and designs. This is not, of course, the color of Matthew Perry's actual uniform, but it sort of blends the blue of the American Navy with, you know, sort of images that Japanese viewers would have known were similar to sort of a military style uniform, right? And of course, we know also from the reading that Japanese were not used to meeting people with blue eyes. And he's actually drawn Matthew, the artist, whose name we don't know, has drawn Matthew Perry with blue eyes, although he put the blue maybe somewhere not quite where Matthew Perry's eyes would have been. And this gives, you know, just one example of how Americans and Japanese are both representing the same thing, but with different visual conventions. And if you look through the document packet, you'll see all kinds of images where we see here a drawing, this is a lithograph based on a drawing that, by a German artist who accompanied the Americans. And you can read more of the background of that in the reading for tonight, depicting the Americans delivering President Fillmore's letter to the Japanese representatives, and that sort of depict the Americans in a particular way, very upright, all very orderly, and I'm sure that was the case for the actual ceremony itself. And then I just couldn't resist sharing this image. This is by an artist, we only know his name as Hachiro Maro, who is drawing an image of American sailors drinking, right? You know, and it's sort of an amusing picture of maybe an inebriated sailor. And some of the text has been translated on the website of the Library of Congress, but not enough. So we don't know the full story of all that. But you can just sort of see how these two cultures interacted and how they sort of imagined each other. Now, the Library of Congress collection has tons of these images, both images by Americans and by Japanese. And what they do is they can be juxtaposed one-on-one. They also allow you to dive really deep into sort of very elaborate Japanese sources, particularly the tradition of scroll painting, right? Painting on a long sort of scroll that would allow sort of, you know, Japanese artists to depict many scenes in the interaction between Americans and the Japanese. And, you know, we have that on the Library of Congress website as such. The Library of Congress also collaborated with a group of historians at MIT, including a Japanese historian, to turn this into a kind of a more web-friendly phenomenon, right? Because why look at a physical scroll you know, when if you can't get to Washington to see the scroll itself, we can look online to see that. So what I'm going to do now is switch gears from this PowerPoint and show you an image of this online on the website of an organization called Visualizing Cultures. Right now, what you should be seeing is this is the image of Visualizing Cultures. And Elena or Lynn, can you tell me if I'm projecting the right thing?
We can see the website.
Okay.
The block in the middle is black.
Okay, but that's exactly, we're at least in the right place, right? So we'll of course share this URL, you'll be able to get to it, but I wanted to just walk you through to some of the online materials, and in particular, basically a very web-friendly image of a website called Black Ships and Samurai about the opening of Japan. And if you click all the way through, we'll see this black ship scroll that was painted in Shimoda, a treaty port in Japan in 1854. And that we can in fact actually follow from right to left, just as it was meant to be viewed 150 years ago. And this gives you a chance, either in class or outside of class, to allow students to just to see, and they can also read the background behind it, to understand, how Americans were seeing, not only how Americans were seeing the Japanese, but how the Japanese were seeing Americans. And overall, along with this, we get a sense of just how fascinated the two cultures were with each other. That the Americans, for example, were fascinated by Japanese temples and shrines, by Japanese fishing practices and whaling, by dress and hair, by the so-called geisha culture of women. And you see this documented in the American images. The Japanese, as they were watching the Americans, were also fascinated by them. They were particularly curious about American technology, not only the big sort of steam ships, but also things like telescopes, other technologies like that. They did occasionally use this scroll and others to make fun of the Americans. They made fun of the Americans sailors for doing their own laundry, which you can see, it's just coming onto the screen right now. They made fun of Americans for not knowing, not knowing how to prepare rice. They were curious about Americans and their physical attributes. And of course, they are meeting a very diverse array of Americans. The American Navy was a sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic organization in the 1850s. So they're meeting not only white American sailors, but also African American sailors, even probably some South Pacific sailors, Pacific Islanders, and also some Chinese sort of merchant sailors who came along on the voyage as well, right? And so this is a moment that, I'll just sort of let this keep running for a minute, but I think between this scroll as it's going along, here you see an image of a camera, right? Sort of technology is another theme. You can also see the actual scroll and dive into it even more deeply than that. Let me just stop there and switch back to the PowerPoint from here. And just to conclude, right, it does remind us that these are two cultures that didn't necessarily know very much about each other, but they're turning to visual images to make sense of each other. And that in 1850s is happening very much in a spirit of curiosity and exploration of two cultures that don't necessarily know what to expect when the American ships arrive in Tokyo Bay. But of course, if you fast forward to World War II or later periods, the images that Americans drew of Japanese or that Japanese drew of Americans would become more critical, uglier, more violent, more filled with racial stereotype and division, which had an impact on the violence of the Pacific War in World War II. All right, so images have power, they have consequences. And we want to encourage our students to think and use the visual to be curious about culture, but also not to let sort of cultures of stereotype or of disparagement sort of creep into the way that we depict people who are different from us, right? And so I think that this website gives you a way to just sort of explore two cultures meeting each other visually at a critical moment in American and world history. And with that, I think I will turn things over to Lynne, who will, take us on a bit of a journey to answer our fourth question. How could we inspire students to find and use resources like this?
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's exactly where I'm going to be building on. And I think that when we talk about looking at historical images, we're also talking about literacy skills, right? Because we need our students to study history in part so that they can engage as citizens in the wider world. And I mean, we could go into all kinds of ways that images can be communicated and miscommunicated in the current context. But I was actually really fortunate last week to attend a webinar from the Stanford History Education Group. Many of you know their historical thinking skills, curriculum, and materials, and they're launching new materials about civic online reasoning. And there's a concept out of that that I really grabbed and I think we can really apply to historical research in a way to help our students think about research a little bit differently. So, what this concept is the idea of vertical searching versus lateral searching. And I think many times when our students find something, so for example, when they find this image of Commodore Perry's landing party in July 1853, they look at it laterally. And I think we teach them to look at it laterally because we ask them to look at the title, they get the image, they download, they zoom in, and we always remind them to read that metadata that goes with it, right? Who was creating it, time, any kind of captions, medium, any kind of clues. But I think we need to think about this concept of lateral searching. So the connection here is that when you're teaching students to fact check something, right? Maybe they have seen a video that's being shared on Twitter. Maybe they've seen a commercial. We teach them to search, right? To ask questions. Who's behind this? Who's putting this website out? Who's funding this? What's their point of view? Is there an agenda? And what we're essentially teaching them to do is to think about opening different tabs on their browser and asking different questions. So what I thought we'd do as a little exercise is we'd take a look at one of these images. This was in your packet. And what I'd love for you to do is go in the question box and ask a question. Maybe it's a question that you have about the image. Maybe it's a question that your students might have about the image. So what kinds of questions would be produced if you worked on this image in course? And again, I want you to think too like you are a History Day student. You found an image. You've got something that you're going to put on your website or in your documentary. But Elena, what kinds of questions are out there that either teachers might generate or their students might generate?
So we have a few questions about the Library of Congress thumbnails and how to make those larger. On the website, we have 4 questions on that so far.
Why don't I pause and take that? That's a key question.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to look in the Library of Congress. When you find an image, you have to look at just below that and see what options you have for download. If you can only download a thumbnail, that is usually an indication that the image is under copyright, and therefore they cannot put a large format one on the website, so you can't just take it. The older images tend to be better. Now, you can tell this is still a little blurry, and I downloaded the largest one that I could, because sometimes the scanning quality is better than others. But whenever in doubt, I always teach students to download the largest version of the file possible. But know that if you can't, that's probably because it's a copyright image. And you know that once you're past 1923, more and more things are copyright. Once you go before that, though, there can be a lot of fun things. So let's kind of reset here. Looking at this image, what kinds of questions might you have about the image, or might your students have if this is their topic for their History Day project?
So we have, what month, season is this taking place in?
Okay.
What's the year?
Mm-hmm.
Where are the Japanese and what are they thinking? Mm-hmm. Then we have, could the people talk to each other?
Yeah.
Um,
That translation question, that causes all kinds of interesting issues in history. What else?
what is the other flag and who does it represent? Is this an image of a ceremony or colonization?
Ooh, interesting. Keep them coming.
Who are the two different groups of people coming from the boats and why are they using two different ramps?
Mm-hmm.
What is the reason for the procession? Is
Okay.
the dog American or Japanese? Did the Japanese even have dogs?
Ooh,
Was this one of those war dogs?
students love coming, and students, honestly, when you use images with students, they will see things that you will never see, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I'll be honest, I didn't notice the dog in the picture, but now I see the dog in the picture. Okay,
We
let's see,
have,
3 or 4 more. What other kinds of questions might your students ask?
what is the mountain called? Where is this? What is the occasion that drew them together? Who are the people involved? And are there specific leaders noted in the picture that we could follow up on?
Absolutely. And I think the more you work with students, a lot of times they start where you started, right? Some of those who, what, where questions. Where is this? Who's there? And a lot of times you say, okay, let's see what we can answer using the metadata. So we can get things like date and location. But then the more you let students ask questions, the more they're going to develop into kind of more interesting questions. So you might get questions about the artist. Who was this Charles Severin? Was he actually there? Did he see this happen, or is he creating an image? How did Matthew Perry get this assignment? Why does he get to go to Japan as opposed to other military or naval leaders? You might get into questions about why did the U.S. want to trade with Japan in the first place? What's going on from an economic or a diplomatic point of view? What goes on at the Treaty of Kanagawa? And this idea of gunboat diplomacy, what is it? Did it work in other places? Is it the first time it's used? Is it the last time it's used? Another interesting question students might come up with is, did Perry keep a diary? Do we have a record? Do we have Commodore Perry's account of what happened? Where was this published? We know it's a lithograph. So where was it published? When was it published? How long after the event? And what was the reaction in American newspapers? And the idea behind lateral searching is that you stop, you generate the questions, and think about making each of these questions a new tab in your browser. Now pause for a second. I realize if you're working with a room full of 8th graders, the idea of having them open 10 or 20 tabs on their browser is going to cause all kinds of rabbit holes. And that's not really what you want to do, but what you want to do is help your students pace it out. So maybe what they do is they generate 5 really good questions. And then maybe you work on them for a course of a week. Maybe they have a 15-minute window in which their job is, okay, today I want everybody to tackle your question number 1 and see what you can find. And I think that this is a really important strategy and kind of teaching students to think about it in a different way, to say, okay, how can one source build to other primary and secondary sources that are going to teach us even more about our topic? And I think that's really key for students, especially once they get over that initial research hurdle, right? Once they got the basics of their event down, sometimes when they're doing more research, they tend to find sources that kind of say the same thing, right? Have the basic information repeated over and over again. And if they're just searching that, Matthew Perry, Japan, they're going to keep getting those kinds of sources. But what's so cool is that you can work with the Library of Congress to find all kinds of other sources to help you answer these questions, and lots of different secondary sources. I always say, start with secondary, get the concept, then go dig into the primary so that those make more sense to you. And if you've got a really kind of interesting student or outside of the box student, you might get a question about this image. Now, if you looked ahead in the PowerPoint, do not fess up and spoil the surprise if you didn't know it ahead of time. What's this a picture of? It's like our nerd moment of the night. What do we see in the picture? So, and again, I want you to look, not being just like, here's the right answer. What do we see? Give us some things that you see. Again, drop them right in that question box. Elena will verbalize some of them. What's going on here?
All men.
It's all men. Agreed. What else do we see?
Different color uniforms.
Yeah, there's all different kind of uniforms, particularly in this first row of men standing right behind the gentleman at the microphone.
We have a backwards flag.
We have the backwards flag. We're going to come back to that, but that's a good observation. What else do you see?
A military speech.
Okay, there's some kind of, there's a microphone, right? Something's being recorded or projected.
So we have a few different people saying the flag, military ceremony with an American flag, different levels of power,
Okay.
different ranks.
Okay, let's ask, who is the gentleman standing at the microphone? This is like nerd moment here. Somebody's going to know this.
MacArthur.
That is General MacArthur, and he's standing at a microphone. Who is the row of gentlemen standing behind him? You may not necessarily have to know their names. You may recognize one or two of them, but what do these uniforms represent?
French allies.
Ah, yes, we've got Allied powers.
Some with maybe Russian soldiers, Allied powers, the French, different branches of military, Soviets.
And do we notice something about the gentleman standing directly behind MacArthur? So if I'm the photographer looking straight, what do we notice about the men standing there? This is a tougher one. Gotta look for a second. There's something that's just a little bit different or off. Any guesses here?
Someone says maybe he's Japanese.
Good guess. They're not Japanese. These are actually American officers.
A lot of people commenting on the shorts.
Ah, yes. Some of us now will actually recognize that better because of if you're a fan of The Crown, you know that that's a British naval uniform for warm weather. But go back to those American officers here. We know we've picked out that it's MacArthur, so we know this is World War II. There's something missing from their uniforms.
Some people say they're not decorated.
There's not a lot of medals. Are they in dress uniforms?
Less formally dressed.
Ah, what's missing from their uniforms? That would have been a part of any World War II officer uniform.
Several people say stripes on pants.
Okay, what else? There's something really obvious. Look at the gentleman standing behind MacArthur, then look at the American officers. What's the uniform piece?
No ranks, no ribbons.
Oh, I'm waiting for somebody to get it.
We have no tie. We have
no ties. Ooh, now we're getting it. Now we're getting it. Good. I was going to hold for that one for a second. Now, what is this a picture of? You've got General MacArthur. You've got Allied leaders. What's the location? Where are we standing? Any guesses? And if you know this one, you can go ahead and pipe in now.
Someone said,
don't worry about raising your hand. Just tell us. Go in that question box and tell us.
So we have Philippines, battleship, USS Missouri.
We are, ding, ding, ding. We are on the United States ship Missouri. It is September 2nd, 1945. And General MacArthur is there to receive the surrender of the Japanese Empire. Now, several of you early on picked out the flag. The flag looks to us like it is backwards, and the reason for that is that it is on the starboard side of the ship. And if the ship is moving forward and the flag would be flying, we display it in that way, which makes it look backwards to us. That flag is actually Commodore Matthew Perry's flag. Now, Commodore Matthew Perry's flag did not live on the USS Missouri. This is obviously, almost 100 years later, and it was retired and displayed at the United States Naval Academy. But that flag is flown from the Naval Academy to the Missouri in time for the surrender, where it is placed above what is called the surrender deck, where the surrender is signed. And that is full of all kinds of communication and miscommunication issues that I think could create some really interesting legacy questions for students. Okay, I'm gonna get off my nerd step foot here. I want to throw one shameless plug before we go into questions. I want to give you a reminder that as this series wraps in December, we have another webinar series. Now, I know some of you participated in the summer. If you're with us in the summer, you're not eligible to join us again, but we are accepting applications for our historical argumentation webinar series. Go to nhd.org/PD if you're interested. If you're not interested, but you might have friends or colleagues who might want to come learn with us and have the same opportunities that you have for PD credits or for grad credits or PD hours, please have them get in touch with us and get those applications in. I'll give a little hint. Right now, there are 58 opportunities. There's a good chance that number's going to go up. So we want to make sure we get teachers in for this opportunity. All right, we are pushing up on our time. So let's do this. Reminder, don't go before you complete your survey. It's easy, 2 minutes. tinyurl.com/nhd-isr21. Take a minute, jot that down with your pen before you get caught up in question and answer. If you need to go, we completely understand that. Thank you for your time tonight. And we'll say a huge thank you up front to the Library of Congress and the Teaching with Primary Sources program that is allowing us to work with you this semester. All right, if you are going to stay on for Q&A, I'm hoping you've got some good questions. We are happy to take questions about the content that Dr. Capozzola presented, the strategy that I presented, National History Day, or anything else you want to ask us. All right, don't get us fired tonight. My boss might be listening. So, what questions, Elena, are there any in the question box for us to address?
I think this one is interesting. Somebody brought it up when you were showing the 19th Amendment images, Chris, and it's Dodie. They say, I think it was a woman that drew the 1909 photo as well. Do you know who drew that cartoon?
Yes, I do. Give me just 1 second. We do know who drew it, and the name. Sorry. Here we go.
It's okay. It's always better to check your source than it is to just make up an answer. Because if you're a teacher, you never ever make up an answer. Some kid will catch you every single time. There we go.
I'm going into the packet, or you could follow the link if you have it. And the artist is E.W. Guston, and I think I remember looking this up because that's not, of course, a name I knew anything about. And I'm pretty sure that's a man, but who was a supporter of, or sorry, was a critic of women's suffrage. And so, you know, we don't know too much about that. We also don't know, just again with the illustrator of the pro-suffrage sheet music. We don't know anything about the political views of that illustrator. Remember, sometimes illustrators are just paid for their drawings, right? And we can find people who drew both pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage images. That doesn't mean that they, you know, changed their mind or that they couldn't make up their mind. It might just mean that they were professional artists who were willing to, you know, sort of write for anyone who could, you know, put food on the table, right? So that can be worth thinking about as well. But while I'm at it, I'll also put in a plug. The Library of Congress collections, one of them is of suffrage sheet music in particular, right? And so it's a great way, you know, particularly for students, they can just use the cover images of the sheet music, or, you know, if they find a really good song, you know, they can play it or sing it. Some of these songs are really pretty basic, so you could do them, you know, in a pretty basic effort. And one of the questions is about recording the songs. And in fact, some of them have been recorded, but so much of recorded sound from the 1910s was put on old-fashioned wax cylinders. Before there were records, which were flat and round, they were sort of more like tubes that were made of wax and that are pretty hard to, you know, to reconstruct after the fact. So, you know, you might be able to find some of them online, but none come immediately to mind.
That's great. You just answered Vicky's question, who just asked, is there any effort to record the song? All right. Well, then we have the question about the thumbnails, which Linda already explained. Terry asks for Chris, how has the presence of the Dutch influenced the United States and Japan and their perception of each other?
So that's a great question. And if you're teaching world history, you know that 1850s is certainly not the first time that the Japanese have been in contact with the rest of Asia or with the West, and also not the first time that the Americans have been in Asia or the Pacific. And there were sort of small settlements of Dutch missionaries and also traders and others who were in a few so-called treaty ports of Japan. One of them being the city of Nagasaki, of course, a place that would come to matter during World War II in the atomic bombing. And the Dutch were some of the only Westerners who had written at length about Japan and Japanese culture. And so when Matthew Perry traveled to Japan, he and the other officers were studying as much as they could get their hands on. And most of that had been written, most of it had been written by missionaries, doctors, and others, including Dutch settlers. And some had actually been written by shipwrecked sailors, right? So one of the questions that came up in the open-ended discussion was, how are these people communicating with each other? And there is a small number of translators who can speak both languages. And one of them was a Japanese sailor who had been shipwrecked and was picked up by an American whaling ship. And he returned to Massachusetts for several years, learned English, and then actually traveled back to Japan with one of the Perry expeditions. So I think that's an important question as we think about communication: is how are people actually sort of talking to each other along the way?
Excellent. Any other questions in the queue tonight?
The last one is, in the watercolor USS Susquehanna, what does the flag on the right represent?
I have a guess. I do not have an answer on that one. My guess is this is some kind of regimental flag, something that's designating a ship or a group within the military. Oftentimes there are these different kind of flags, but I'm going to actually defer to Dr. Capozzola here to see if you have a historical answer.
I don't have a historical answer that I can give with confidence. Like Lynn, I think it's probably a very Navy specific flag that might be to which, among other things, which part of the fleet it's in. What in later periods would have been called the Asiatic Squadron. There might be that kind of flag that goes along with the U.S. flag. I don't know, and we also don't know if the Japanese artist depicted it as it actually was. So it could be a little bit challenging to go, sort of research that along the way. Certainly, I wouldn't trust if you look at how the Japanese artist has depicted the steam, right, or the sort of the smoke that's coming from the coal-fired ship, you can see, the artist is taking some liberties with the depiction in that image.
Well, I think it's important, our students see that images are constructed, whether they're photographs or whether they are drawings or lithographs or engravings of some kind. All right.
We just got another question for this NHD question. Do you have any suggestions about how students could use images in a performance?
That's a great question. We have seen students be really creative. Sometimes they are used solely as research sources, maybe to help influence things like their costuming, their sets or backdrops or props, or what was going on depending on their topic. I have seen students do some creative things with projecting images. But I'll have to be honest with you, my favorite performances are the ones that are really, really simple. I think sometimes some of our performance students get really caught up in sets and props, and I have seen some amazing sets and props, and sometimes I'm so paying attention to what's going on in the backdrop or the set that I kind of miss what's going on in the actual performance because I get distracted. That might just be my personal preference, but I think there's some interesting ways, and I think too this year, and actually Elena can speak to this better than I can because she was working on the task force with this. If we are virtual for your regional or your affiliate or the national contest, students will be able to record their performances. And Elena, do you want to answer any ways they might be able to use images as part of that?
So we've encouraged students, if they will be doing a virtual performance, to get creative with like backgrounds. So students can either create, if they want to record with their group over Zoom or something like that, they can get creative with what they have behind them. So maybe like a blown up picture as a backdrop, or they could use a Zoom background or any other kind of digital background. So they can get more creative with images that way, especially this year in the virtual content setting.
It's just really key. If they're using those images, make sure they show up in that annotated bibliography, right? And if they get a collection of images, it's okay to cite a collection. And they can explain, hey, I use this as backdrop. I use this to help design my costume. I use this to realize that this person in history would have carried this particular prop. And I integrated that into my performance because. All right. Anything else for the evening?
That's all we have.
All right. Well, I want to say a huge thank you. Thank you, Dr. Capozzola, for joining us. Thank you, Elena, for jumping on and managing our Q&A. Remember, before you go, tinyurl.com/NHDISR21. Please give us your feedback. We compile it, we use it, we look at it, and we share it out. And it's so important that we get that feedback, not just for us, but also for the team at the library who's been so kind and generous to fund the contract that is helping to support the program. All right, I think we're going to end there for the evening. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.